It was the 7th of June of 1099, in the dusty deserts of Palestine. A long column of Christian troops finally arrived at their long-awaited destination, the holy city of Jerusalem. The Siege of Jerusalem. The culmination of all the efforts of the First Crusade was about to begin. The First Crusade had been called in 1095 at the request of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, who intended to recapture lost territory from the Muslim states spreading on the east. The answer of the European kingdoms was a large-scale operation to establish Christian institutions in the Holy Land and conquer the holy city of Jerusalem. Finally, after countless struggles among themselves against the Muslims, the weather and the shortage of water and supplies, Jerusalem was within the Crusaders. Grasp, the Christian army, was led by a coalition of Italian, Norman, and Frankish nobles. The most important of them were Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse and Tripoli, Duke Robert II of Normandy, William the Conqueror's eldest son, Count Robert II of Flanders, and a famous Norman knight by the name of Tancred. These four were led by the general commander of the crusade, Godfrey of Bouillon, who would ultimately lead the siege under Christian banners, marched a total of around 13,000 men, with only 1,500 knights remaining, while the Crusader army prepared the siege. The defenders watched from atop the walls. Jerusalem was under the rule of Ifar Adala Fatimid. Amir of Jerusalem, Adala had prepared for the siege thoroughly, stacking plenty of supplies and rallying a formidable garrison of Arab and Sudanese troops in stark contrast to the preparation of the Muslims. The Christian army lacked cohesion numbers and, most importantly, supplies. Another of the emir's measures was to poison the surrounding wells, with the besiegers having to travel over 6 miles under the hot sun to reach the nearest source of water. A 400-strong detachment of Muslim cavalry galloped around the city, with their only task being the harassment of the Crusader search parties. The Crusader commander Godfrey of Bouillon was aware that he didn't have the men or the supplies to starve the Muslims out. Thus, preparations for an assault on the walls soon began. The ravines running along the eastern and western walls made an attack impossible on these sides, so Raymond IV laid camp to the south of the city, while the rest of the forces prepared an assault on the northern music wall on June 13th. The first assault on the walls of Jerusalem took place. The Crusaders pushed their ladders forward towards the northern wall of Jerusalem. On the battlements, the Fatimid archers incessantly rained down arrows on the defenders when the Christian ladders reached the wall. The battered Crusader infantry lined up behind them, and the hard-fought climb began by the end of the day. In spite of the efforts of the attackers, the walls of Jerusalem remained unbreached. The Crusaders' limited storage of wood had been spent on making the ladders for the assault, and the few patches of forest in the surrounding had been depleted by the Fatimids. Before their arrival, without the materials for building more siege works, the progress of the siege was stalled, and an exhaustive search for source materials in the region began. The small detachments of Crusaders were often picked off by the Fatimid cavalry, making the foraging even more difficult. 4 days later, on the 17th of June, luck finally smiled upon the Crusaders, as news from a small Christian fleet docked at Jaffa reached the camp of the besiegers. Several well-armed convoys of Crusaders set on their way to Jaffa in order to unload the supplies the ships carried. However, the road was treacherous, and they were ambushed by the Fatimid riders. The skirmishers engaged the already exhausted and thirsty Crusaders, and chaos broke out. As the killing carried on, more Christian contingents, who were on the way to Jaffa, joined the fighting eventually, despite the shock factor. The Muslim ambushers were overrun by the Crusader reinforcements and ran off into the desert. After this incident, the Christian convoy finally arrived in Jaffa. The supplies were unloaded and carried to Jerusalem, and when a Muslim fleet surrounded the port, rendering the escape impossible, even the wood used to build the fleet was scavenged. Finally, the Crusaders had the means to build their siege engines, a battering ram, and 2 siege towers were erected, one on the southern side of the city under Raymond IV, and another on the northern wall under Godfrey Bouillon. As the construction progressed, both animals and men began to die from dehydration in the siege camps, and news from a Fatimid relief army reached Jerusalem. However, it soon became apparent that the definitive Christian assault would arrive before the relief army did, and the final preparations for the battle were made within the walls on the 13th of July of 1099. A month after the first assault, the Crusader army that besieged Jerusalem formed its battle order. The Christian forces had deployed similarly to the way they were stationed since the beginning of the siege in the south. Count Raymond IV of Toulouse commanded a fraction of the army and was responsible for the advance of the southern siege tower. The rest of the Frankish force, along with the Flemish and Italo-Normans, were stationed in the north. Under the general command of Godfrey of Boujoun, on that day, both contingents would storm the walls, forcing the Fatimids to divide their forces and thin out their line of defense at the other side of the walls. The Fatimids hadn't remained idle. They had stationed several mangonels both on the walls and in the streets, which would be useful to bring down the siege towers. Besides, they had erected barricades and barriers outside the northern wall, which would complicate the access of the siege tower. In order to bring down these barricades, the Crusaders on the northern wall had also built a battering ram, which would open the way for the siege tower. The success of the Crusaders relied entirely on their siege engine. The gathering of the materials had been hard, and if the siege towers fell, they wouldn't get another chance to breach the walls with the men ready and the battle plans drawn. The Christian armies initiated their advance. The battering ram in the northern wall marched forward and began breaking down the barriers, the men pushing. The machine were supported by archers who began trading missiles with the defenders behind the battering ram. Came the siege tower, which took tremendous amounts of effort and manpower to be operated and moved at an except-alley slow rate. The Fatimid archers who released their projectiles from the walls desperately tried to set the ram aflame by releasing volleys of flaming arrows. As time went on, several ambushes were launched on the battering ram by Fatimid skirmish forces, who awaited outside the city walls. The fighting was fierce, and the Crusaders were able to fend off these attacks, while the attackers on the northern wall put their efforts into pushing their equipment. The Franks under Raymond IV fought to place their own siege tower on the walls. The battlements were filled to the brim with archers, and the advance of the Franks was hard fought. Eventually, the push of the Franks severely stalled due to the fact that their siege tower had been torched aflame by the fire arrows of the defenders. In spite of the efforts of the Crusaders, when night fell, the walls of the city hadn't been breached, as neither of the siege towers had reached the enemy ramparts. However, retreat was no longer an option for the Christians, and for another 2 days, the struggle continued. On the third day of fighting the Crusader ram finally tore down the last of the Fatimid barricades. However, the ram was stuck in a position where it couldn't be quickly moved, and the attackers resorted to trying to set it aflame to clear the path for the siege tower. Interestingly, the Fids who had spent 2 days trying to burn the ram were now the ones putting the fire out with water, while the Crusaders who had defended the siege engine for 2 days were the ones who were now trying to destroy it. Finally, the ram was burnt to ashes, and as the siege tower advanced, it became the new objective of the Fatimid archers. Despite the slow advance and the desperate attempts of the defenders to set the tower aflame, the smoking siege engines eventually reached the northern wall of Jerusalem. Now the fighting for the walls would begin. As the fighting on the ramparts raged, more siege ladders were pushed up to other sections of the walls. Waves of Normans and Franks piled behind the tower and ladders and swarmed the Fatimid battlements. After heavy fighting, the Crusaders finally took control of the walls and began entering the city en masse. At this point, the Fatimid defense disintegrated and the massacre began. The city was lost. The Christian army swept through the city, killing and pillaging in a rampage that even Western sources described as barbaric. Contemporary historians set the number of casualties at around 40,000, with men, women, and children, Muslim and Jewish, being slaughtered on the spot. Despite this tragic end, the conquest of Jerusalem was a significant triumph for Christendom and marked the beginning of a new age for the Crusader states. the Kingdom of Jerusalem was established with Godfrey of Bouillon as ruler, thus achieving the objective of the First Crusade. From that moment onwards, Christendom had a significant foothold on the Holy Land, from which several subsequent crusades would be fought.